of Jesus Christ and its connection to the historical and ongoing struggle against racial justice or injustice in America. So basically, for those of you that have read it, Cone's thesis is both simple and profound. First, he argues that the cross on which Jesus was crucified and the tree on which African Americans were lynched are deeply connected symbols of suffering and oppression. He suggests that to truly understand the meaning of the cross, and this is important for me and to shift how I understood things, we must see it through the lens of the lynching tree, and he offers vice versa. Right? So, this perspective forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the crucifixion was not just a distant historical event, but a manifestation of the same kinds of forces of hatred and exclusion that have plagued humanity throughout history, including in the form of lynching in America. So, the lynching tree, as Cone describes, is a symbol of the terror and the violence inflicted upon Black bodies in the United States. It represents the dehumanization and the brutalization of African Americans who were often lynched without trial based on false assumptions or simply for challenging the status quo of white supremacy. These acts of violence were not isolated incidents, but a part of a larger system of racial oppression that sought to maintain the social, economic, and political dominance of whites. And I think it's important that we understand that because this is not just about race, right? This is about economic power, right? And political power and dominance. So always frame it in this intersectionality. A lot of times when we do anti-racism, we just stick to race rather than expanding the understanding that it's not just about race, it's about economic power and oppression or suppression, political power, land ownership, and all of those kinds of things that go into this. The other thing that I think is important for us to articulate today um, is that we not understand this as with the Mandela effect, which is that thing like this has happened a long time ago, right? Like the concept that I had to understand that like people like Ruby Bridges, right? The young Black woman that integrated the school, like is still alive. Like she's not even 70 yet, right? Like, and so this stuff is not that long ago. And that's why this is important for us to gather. So in this book and how it's structured, I'm going to lift up about 3 or 4 things that I saw, and then I'll bring it to kind of a conclusion. The first is I love that he gave a historical context of lynching. If you've not done so, I think that taking a trip or taking a journey to the Equal EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, that is led by or founded by Brian Stevenson, the author of Just Mercy book, and how he goes around to collect data to talk about where lynchings occurred, and he takes soil and he's created a memorial there in Montgomery. And this book gives us a concretization of the historical context of lynching. He provides a historical overview of lynching, emphasizing its role as a tool of racial terror and control. Right? He describes the brutal and the public nature of lynchings, which were often attended by large crowds and left the bodies of victims on display as a warning to other individuals. So that's one appreciation that I have for this text. The second is the actual content, right? I think it's brave that he is bold enough, like many liberation theologians, to kind of augment or amplify the connection between faith and the reality of people's lives. So he draws parallels between the crucifixion of Jesus and the lynching of Black individuals, arguing that both were public acts of violence meant to instill fear and maintain oppressive power structures. And he goes further by suggesting that the cross can be seen as a symbol of suffering and resistance, which we know that, much like the lynching tree as well. I think the third thing, so not just the history of lynching in America that he provides, that often is, and this book would probably be banned in these times, right? The content of it is such that it really brings an indictment upon how we live or how we engage, right? But we've got to own this as people of faith, because he also talks about the theology of the cross, right? Where Cone critiques traditional Christian theology for its failure to adequately address the suffering and the oppression of Black Americans. I just want to pause there, right? And a lot of times we think in Lutheranism that we're not complicit. Let's not go to Tennessee to Dan Call's church there in the Lynchburg area, a Lutheran pastor who also enslaved individuals, who enslaved a man named Uncle Nearest, right? Who taught Jack Daniels how to do the distillery, right? So the American staple, right? Pretty much the only drink that we really fully created right here on American soil or land. The distillery process was taught to him by an enslaved Black man on a Lutheran church campus. So we are complicit. So Pastor Dan Call was a pastor of a Lutheran church who owned slaves and was selling moonshine and other things in the back of the church, until one day that the church gave him an ultimatum: either you're going to be a distiller or you're going to be the pastor. And as the story goes, he chose to be the pastor and sold off the distillery factory to Jack Daniels, who was taught how to do distillery by Uncle Nearest, which is now a brand that has been revived in recent years. So my point of bringing that up is to talk about the complicity of Lutheranism with in slavery and just injustice, because a lot of times we think that we're so progressive and we're really not. So Cone calls for the theology of the cross that recognizes the connection between Jesus's crucifixion and the lynching of Black individuals, emphasizing a God who is in solidarity with the oppressed. The fourth thing is his critique of the American church. He challenges the church for its silence and its complicity in the face of racial injustice. He argues that the church must confront its role in perpetuating racism and actively work towards racial conciliation and justice, in the same way that there are individuals who are now within the church talking about, and within mainline church, talking about what's going on in Gaza and Palestine, Israel, right? But we've not heard from Bishop Curry, from the Episcopal Church, and other main leaders, and little small statements about prayers is different than a statement to articulate what's happening over there as pure genocide. Right? So those are concerns that Cone would have addressed today. And lastly, he doesn't end there. Just like every good preacher, you got to have good news, right? He gives a sense of hope and liberation. Despite the grim history of lynching, Cone offers a message of hope and liberation, where he asserts that the resurrection of Jesus provides a promise of triumph over death and oppression, inspiring a faith that is committed to justice and liberation for all people. So throughout the book, Cone weaves together a theology, history, and a social critique to present a powerful argument for the relevance of the cross in addressing racial justice in the world around us. So I believe that Jesus and the lynching tree is a call to the church and to society to confront the realities of racism and to work towards a more just and an equitable world. So how did we get here, and what's the significant value of this work? In Cone's own words, he discusses his earlier reflections on the Christian faith and white supremacy in his work, obviously, as I iterated previously, The God of the Oppressed, and focuses on the social evils of slavery and segregation. So he raises some questions that many of you might have tonight. How could whites confess and live the Christian faith and also impose a 3.5 centuries year old of slavery and segregation upon Black people? How could they do that? How could they go to church, be deacons, be pastors, right? Be leaders, right? Know and understand the text, right? Have education about the text and what the gospel states, and still impose and be a part of or be complicit in 3.5 centuries of slavery. So Cone asserts that self-interest, he calls it out about self-interest, right? That level of concupiscence and power corrupted their understanding of the Christian gospel, their own safety, making it okay for me. And that's what happens in the world today. People, when you're talking about anti-racism, feel uncomfortable because they feel like we live in this zero-sum game of life, which we're not, because we as people of faith know that the earth is the Lord's, the world and the fullness thereof, and all that they that dwell therein, right? So this zero-sum game, which is a real strong Western concept of I've got to get mine and I've got to prepare and keep for my family, and people that are coming in are going to take from me. And God has enough for everybody for us not to live in that sense of fear. So Cone then asked, how could powerless Blacks endure and resist the brutality of white supremacy in nearly every aspect of their lives and still keep their sanity? Now, I'm still asking myself that question, right? About a whole lot of different things, because you get exhausted, right? Like there's a sense of fatigue to have to deal with this, and it gets in your DNA, if you will, like this history of when people talk about getting over it, right? It's tough. I'm dealing stuff that my ancestors are still manifesting, and you feel that in your body, and you naturally react to it and respond to it. So Cone concluded that an imminent presence of a transcendent revelation confirming for Blacks that they were more than what whites said about them, gave them an inner spiritual strength to cope with anything that came their way. Now, when I read his quote about that, I almost rolled over on the floor and leaped from walls and ran over troops and swung from the chandeliers, because that is true. Realizing and that's how levels of survival have been for groups and minorities of color, is realizing that what oppressive states and what oppressive populations have said about them is not what God has said about them, right? That I'm a child of God, that I'm created in the imago Dei, the image of God. Whether you appreciate me, whether you like me or not, right? We're all connected. So he says that he wrote this because words were his weapon to resist, to affirm Black humanity, and to defend it. I'm gonna conclude with this. So, as a Southerner, he who lived through high lynching times in America, Cone, he avoided dealing directly with the reality of lynching. As a Southern Black, the subject brought back such painful feelings for him, but at some point, he felt he had no choice. In fact, he said of this book, he said the subject matter chose him, right? And it reminds me even of my own personal testimony of, I grew up kind of in an all lives matter world, right? I'm dating myself now, and those of you that may have watched TV years ago, where Alex P. Keaton, played by Michael J. Fox, like he was my idol, right? Like the preppy boy in Family Ties, the movie. I mean the TV show, right? And I ended up going to college, a Black college at the time, Morehouse College, and I came in with this kind of conservative and we all need to get along kind of stuff or whatever, until on my college campus, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation came into a peaceful protest after the Rodney King uprising in California, and they bombed our dorms at Morehouse and whatever. And that was my wake up call for a level of differentiation between what certain groups and populations could do with their freedom of speech and freedom of living, and how other populations were policed and or oppressed or suppressed, right? So that helped me as well to understand. So I could relate to what Cone is talking about in this book, because there are movements that chose me. I didn't want to go be about this, right? I did want to say all lives matter, but I can't say all lives matter because all lives do not matter in the structure of this of these yet to be United States in America. So this symbol of white supremacy, lynching, is a nightmare for us all. When we look at many of the images of tortured Black bodies, it becomes a deep challenge and the most painful experience, especially as a theologian. At times, it was almost too heavy for me, even in the book. The more I read about it and looked at what whites did to powerless Blacks, the angrier I became. So, in an interview with Ruth Haley Barton, Cone gives us a poignant understanding of this work in a nutshell. He says, paradoxically, anger soon gave way to a profound feeling of liberation. Being able to write about lynching liberated me from being confined by it. The cross helped me to deal with the brutal legacy of the lynching tree, and the lynching tree helped me to understand the tragic meaning of the cross. Cone's work forces us to confront the reality that the church in America has often been complicit in the system of oppression. Instead of standing as a beacon of hope and justice, the church has frequently been silent in the face of racial injustice, or worse, has actively supported the status quo. So Cone challenges us to re-examine our theology and our practice. That's tough for some of us, but we've done it for other things that we know that needed to happen, to ensure that our faith is not just a personal comfort, but a call to action against injustice. So the message of Jesus and the lynching tree is not one of despair, but of hope and liberation. Cone reminds us that the cross is a symbol of resurrection and triumph over death and oppression. In the same way, the legacy of the lynching tree is not just one of pain and suffering, but is also one of resilience and resistance. African Americans have always fought against their dehumanization, drawing strength from their faith and their community to demand their rights and dignity. So Cone's work brings about a revolution in liberation theology, which should be a theme that you understand, how you understand anti-racism in the church. The use of liberation theology as a significant theological movement, obviously we know that emerged in the 1960s and the 70s, right? Out of South America, and with Gustavo Gutierrez, a Peruvian theologian, emphasizing that liberation is not only about addressing economic and social conditions, but also about achieving spiritual freedom and human dignity. Racism keeps people bound, not just enslaved people, right, or people of color, but it keeps white people bound as well from living into a fullness of their own freedom as well, and being able to love God, all of God's people. So as we reflect tonight on Cone's message, we are called to action. We are called to stand against the forces of racism and injustice in our own time, whether they manifest as police brutality, mass incarceration, economic inequality, or subtle forms of other subtle forms of microaggressions and discrimination. We are called to be allies to those who are oppressed, to listen to their voices, and to work together for a more just and equitable society. So, in this endeavor, the church has a crucial role to play. As a follower of Christ, we are called to embody Christ's message of love, justice, and reconciliation. We are called to be a community that not only preaches about the kingdom of God, but also works to bring it about in the here and now. So, what does this mean for us? It means we've got to confront our own biases and our own privileges, advocating for policies that promote justice and equality, and standing in solidarity with those who are marginalized and oppressed. Jesus and the lynching tree is that prophetic call for us to rethink our understanding of the cross and our commitment to social justice. It challenges us to see the connections between the sufferings of Jesus and the suffering of those who have been lynched in America. It calls us to a deeper, more authentic faith that is not afraid to confront the darkness of our world and to work tirelessly for the light of justice and love. My hope tonight is that we are inspired by the courage and the resilience of those who have suffered and continue to suffer from racial injustice, and commit ourselves to the ongoing work of building a world where every person is valued and every voice is heard and every life is sacred.
Mm.
Awesome.
Wow. That's amazing, Lamont. Mm.
So I said quite a few things. Does anybody have any immediate reactions to or curious thoughts or want me to kind of go further with any particular of the actions that I talked about in from this book? Or what were your impressions of the book? Any of those things?
I don't know if
Or
I've
the concept.
is to read the book. I know that is something that we should definitely commend to anybody who hasn't read it yet. Is the book is called Jesus and the Lynching Tree by James Cone, as Lamont so eloquently stated. And one of the things about that book too that I really appreciated when I read it is the fact that Cone lifts up artists who for centuries have been naming this connection between the cross and the lynching tree, and yet the church, even with those voices out there in the world saying, no, this is like a real connection we should be aware of and not just inspired by, but convicted by the fact that we're doing the same thing to our black siblings that they did to Christ, right? And artists have been naming that in poetry and music and art for centuries, and the church yet has still remained silent. So I always appreciated that voice within the book, that he lifts up artists as the real prophets of our time, who are ones that we can look to as a church for the words or the inspiration to continue the fight for justice too.
Yeah, when I think of the sufferings that Billie Holiday, by singing the song Strange Fruit, right? And when she did it, and obviously she was jailed for it many times, and her drug use, which was a condition not of bad behavior, right, but a response to trauma that was ensued by the pressures of racial injustice. And when you think about that, and other artists like Aretha Franklin and Harry Belafonte and others, and who were artists that really carried forth a social movement that if it had not been for them, that we probably either wouldn't know about certain things, or certain movements would not have been supported and or funded. And Harry Belafonte, who's somebody who Harry Belafonte is probably one of the only people. I'm not starstruck by anything, right? I've never been, but he's probably one of the only people I have ever said I really wanted to meet, and like sit. I wanted to sit at his feet. Like Obama, I've met him, but didn't have to. Like just all, but Harry Belafonte, because he carried so much knowledge about how to support a movement that I still think that we have not benefited from the understanding of how he was able to articulate that and make it happen. But he even carried on in recent years to try to get other major artists to be more conscious and influence some of the outcomes related to racial injustice in the world. And he articulated, and I've heard him say about a year and a half ago, about how hard it was to convince people to speak up and proclaim justice because of economic self-interest that caused them to be able to not do those things. And when I listen to my colleagues, our colleagues in ministry, I hear some of them say the same things, right? They love to bring me in because I leave, right? I come in, I say the things, and then I leave, right? But what are you preaching week after week? How are you informing and educating in your congregation? And many of them talk about having a fear of being either removed from their calls, or they suffer other kinds of injustice in their own lives because of the connection of trying to do the right thing.
Pastor, I did get a chance. I read the book a while back. I need to go back to it, but you had alluded to something about I forget how you put it, but the whole notion of white folks' motivation to get in this work being about saving themselves as opposed to doing the work to save anybody else. And I think that's something that Cone has talked about in the past in various spaces. But I think this book gives us the opportunity, because when we talk about healing, we have not been able to heal as a community because of this thing called repentance. And far too often the white church has wanted reconciliation without repentance. It does not work that way. It works that way in the white church, but it doesn't work that way in the Bible. And so if you could speak to that some, maybe that whole notion of the saviorism of the white church, the whole notion of the white church being a messianic force in the world, that they have projected themselves, not Jesus as the savior, and how that relates to us not being able to build relationships as people with our siblings.
I think, and that's why I think even the church has not said much even about critical race theory and just how we educate and all that kind of stuff. And you should know that it has nothing to their definition and the use of critical race theory and the banning of certain books has nothing to do with it. But one of the things that I think, to your point, that I think has to happen in the church, this could begin at the church. How do we articulate early civilization? There's a book called Stolen Legacy by Sheikh Anta Diop, right, who wrote that many years, that talks about kind of like how the world began and how things came to be. And that's a piece of world history and understanding that gets sliced as if everything started in Europe, when that's just not true. And I wonder how many of our congregational leaders get educated. So my point is to you is, right, a lot of the things that gets lifted up as messianic and just, as white superiority, right, has often been based out of stealing from other cultures and other communities and populations. It is an indictment, but it's a truth indictment, right? This is not like, oh, y'all are bad or whatever like that. This is factually true about how populations came and went to the cradle of civilization, stole understanding, stole understandings of medicine, stole all kinds of and so we're living in a world where the average Black young man and woman or child believes that they have nothing to offer the world when their history comes from an understanding that really fueled and springboarded many of the inventions of the world. Let's not even go back there, right? Let's say we don't go back to Egypt, and we're not going to argue whether Egypt is in Africa. I'm not even going to do that. Even what we know in the world today, in America, these yet to be United States, how we have hidden treasures, hidden figures, right, of things and people that have helped this world, make this country exist, but yet does not get the credit, if you will, right? And that's a part of dehumanization. And that's what Cone talks about in this book, right? And so for me, even as a young Black man, right, grown or younger, I'm not young anymore, is right, I had to have almost an extra canonical understanding and teaching pedagogy from my parents to help me to understand my place in the world is not from a place of subjugation, right? But that my ancestors and our leaders had something to offer. Why doesn't the church also articulate these kinds of things and these understandings? So whether they get it taught in school, a lot of education happens for 20 minutes every Sunday, that we articulate theological and cultural proclivities and understandings, and we misuse it because we feel like we got to separate church and state or separate these kinds of things. And even Luther talked about the two kingdom ethic for us to be able to understand, the ebb and flow of when to rise and fall and connect to various subject matter. So I think that more than anything, if we could increase our conversation and our commitment to a wide range of education and not just start in Wittenberg, Germany, right? But go to the more of Augustana, Saint Augustine and others in other countries and other communities to talk up and lift up their own value, if you will.
I say?
And just real quick too, it's also, and I wanted just to lift up from it's about that economic standpoint, right? It's people are fine in supporting justice initiatives as long as it doesn't take any money out of their pocket, too much time away from their own agendas, right? In order to right these wrongs. That becomes a problem. That self-interest, right? Like I can't do this. They're gonna be mad at me. I can't say this because I'm gonna be hung out there. And then people are suffering every day, whether you say something or not.
Lamont, I believe.
I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
The one word that always strikes me as being the whole basis that I believe is the problem is dehumanization. That we seem to be able to look at certain peoples, whether it be black, white, yellow, whatever, and to say that they are less than, and by dehumanizing them, then we can suppress them because we're human, they're not. Yet we and them as not being the same level of human. And I said, I have to cry every time I see people destroying other people. Just because they are who they are. Whether it be black, whether it be Jew, whether it be any other nationality or race. And in my apartment community, one of the movies that they are showing this week is Harriet. And I remember watching that movie and sitting there with tears running down my face, thinking, how can people do this to other people? It just incomprehensible to me. But the bottom line seems to be the attitude of, well, we're not looking at those people as humans, and so I don't.
Right. You're right. Thank you for that. And what you described tonight, it makes me think of like, how did we get there? As powerful as as I'm articulating as certain places in Africa and Western Africa, Eastern Africa were that were a part of the slave trade, or if you will, or the transatlantic slave trade. Like I often wonder, and I've been to the Goree Island, and and felt what. And been in the slave castles and things like that. And I wondered, like, how did this happen? There are two things that I think, obviously, it's about power, and it's something that we're still living in today. So two things happened that shifted things. So one was in the 16th century, right? Martin Luther wasn't he's great, we appreciate him, right? But the thing that really made him well or famous to existence today is the printing press, right? It's the timing of when he was able to articulate or proclaim his voice and his 95 Theses and et cetera, right? So communication shifted, right? Which is something that is occurring now. Things can get out faster, misinformation, fake news, etc., gets out faster, communication. The second, in regarding power and subjugation, is the use of guns. If it had not been for gunpowder, that invention, right? That the transatlantic slave trade would not have occurred in the same way that we knew. I'm not saying it wouldn't have happened, right? But the power of guns and not, knives and things which tribe leaders maintained as a weapons. Like if that hadn't occurred, I think that this would not have grown larger than it became as an economic windfall for Euro descendant Spaniards and Dutch and all of those populations by that. I'm mentioning that because if we were to root out and bring some control or subjugation to guns and how we disseminate information, right? Like some regulation, some freedom of speech, but some level of regulation against what's false narratives, I think that we would have a different world. But because we don't have a reign on those things, right? We keep being outpowered, if you will, by those realities. Because, I'll speak up all I want, but you put a gun in my face.
Well,
I might say, yes, sir. I might. Depends on how I'm feeling that day. Any other? Yeah.
I'm curious, as a kind of a sidebar, but how was it that the Society of Friends, the Quakers, who were Christian, I think, I don't know enough about this, but what could we of Lutherans who've been so complicit learn from the Quakers, who were very much allies and involved, from what I understand?
Mm-hmm. So I think even still, like the Quakers, and other mainline churches struggled, if you will, with its, and that's really how the abolitionist movement came about, right? Like people realizing, listen, this is not cool. What we're doing here is not not right. And the Quakers, because of their ethics, right? Their strong ethics and against violence and nonviolence and things like that, help them to be able to articulate and create responses that were stronger and more direct and deliberate about abolition. But they too also went home and had friendships with people who they were silent, pun intended, at the dinner tables and things like that. So all faiths, or if you will, had some level of complicity. And I think what they did was bounced off of each other to finally get to a place of articulating a true liberation or freedom movement for all. I don't think they were perfect at it. I mean, there's stories about, about it. And even just like we've even whitewashed, if you will, or slavery washed, however you want to engage it, Abraham Lincoln, who did not intend to free the slave. He was against that, right? But the decision came out of an economic and power decision of who runs the states or who owns America, if you will. And then that's when it became clear for him to support or to abolish slavery.
And he reimbursed the slave owners for every slave lost. He paid them $7.
Yep.
$7 was a lot of money back then, because $7 would represent their work from where they were at now till they died.
Yeah.
They died in the fields. They didn't die in a bed.
Yeah.
So well,
hence the sense of reparations was done, but not for the people who deserved it, if you will.
if a slave
For that.
away, you put your paperwork in, you got $7 from the government.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. True story. True fact.
Lamont, I think about, obviously, 5,000 Black people lynched in this country under Jim Crow.
That
But-
we know of.
That we know of, right?
Right.
But that modern day lynchings are still happening, right? We see police shootings. We see,
We see Trayvon Martin.
just
That
extrajudicial,
was a lynching with the
Right.
gun.
extrajudicial
basically.
killings And to be able to name these as lynchings in our church, I think is a stretch for many people in their minds. It feels like when we connect these two things, like a black body hanging from a tree to the same as Trayvon Martin or George Floyd or anyone who has been killed without due process by law enforcement,
Yeah.
we get pushback for that, right? There's almost like a sacred commitment to the authorities in this country to never speak against them, especially from the pulpit. I wonder what you would say to encourage those of us who might be afraid to do that because of the pushback we would receive from our congregations, about how can we make that connection to today, right? Because we know that lynchings haven't ended, they've evolved into new forms. And so, yeah, what would you say to us on that front?
Well, and I think one of the words as I was preparing this that really came up is that level of self-interest or selfishness that we have to get up, which is probably one of the original sins that is the hardest for any of us to mitigate, right? I mean, we don't mitigate sin, but like, just that we work through, right? And I say that to say there has to become a point, right? Like I can't, whether I want to or not, as I described in my own shifting in my own life, right? I was pulled into having to be, every day that I walk into a room, every conversation that I have is a sense of resistance, particularly in the ELCA, right? Like this whitest church in America, right? Just me showing up because I can't hide that I'm Black, right? So I say, Ben, for me, so I also, to hear me clearly, I've also had a great career in the ELCA. I'm the former president of the National Black Lutheran Association, or ADLA, the African Descent Lutheran Association. And I've been a part of, for the past 10 years, many conversations about colleagues who suffer greatly. Hear me clearly, Ben. I've had great calls. I've got every call I've wanted, I've gotten. I've not, right? So technically, I could be comfortable. But the reason why I served in that capacity is because I saw the suffering of others, right? And that poem, "They came for the Jews," right? And then and then no one, there was no, and I did nothing, and then it came for me, and who was there to speak for me? That whole concept, that for me is the impetus that gives me the ability to say I have fought for many things in this church that didn't affect me. Right? Black women in this church, waiting on the bench for calls for years. Anytime I turn down calls, people are still call, and that's not I'm only saying that I personally have been fine in the ELCA financially, right? Or professionally. But because I care, because I believe in a vocational call, right? Because I believe that God has called me and us to do justice, to do Micah's, right? To do justice and to do and love mercy, and walk humbly with God. That's why I believe that everybody should be compelled to engage and serve and to ready themselves to fight for the oppressed, to support the oppressed. I don't, I do it because it's right to do. And, not because I'm getting anything out of it per se. And actually, it probably has cost me. That's the other thing, right? When we could talk about the cost of discipleship, right? It probably has cost me, right? Like I could have been a bishop before, right? Like because of the trajectories that I've had, I could have had leadership position, but no one wants to support someone who speaks out and makes people feel uncomfortable all the time. When they see me coming, they feel like I'm bringing up. Making them uncomfortable, and I'm not saying that others who were able to make it to certain places don't speak up, but they don't speak up like I do, and they will tell you that they often feel like they can't do that, and that's every bishop of color. So I'm not even I'm not calling one out. All of them have said that.
Sure.
So my point, Ben, is we've got to see a level of investment and knowing that this is right, and whatever it costs,
Yeah.
if you will, to see the victory in this.
Yes.
But you just also said, Pastor, something that is key, that even though you have had access to good cause
Mm-hmm.
and in a trajectory to do things that other people of color may not have been able to do, and be financially okay as well, none of that insulates you from being hurt. I mean, I work for Ford Motor Company. I mean, I make good money.
Mm-hmm.
I'm bivocational. I mean, my kids have lived well. But because of what we say in the pulpit,
Mm-hmm.
we go to, and that's what the mystery of, to me, with my white colleagues that say that they're, I mean, I get it, okay, they're fearful, but I mean, you come into the wrong person, because I'm the only Black pastor in the Southeast Michigan Synod right now with a church call.
Mm.
It's incredible. I mean, I still, and the church
Detroit, yeah.
in
Mm-hmm.
Detroit, one of the most diverse, but and the church don't give a damn.
Mm.
I mean, this church does not. I mean, it's incredible.
And the first that are still happening in 2024.
Yeah, we still marking first.
You're the first.
Yeah.
Oh, aren't you valued? Aren't you? You should be happy. You're the first. You made it, you know. But the first should have been 100 years ago, 200.
Mm-hmm. And that's the danger. Thank you for bringing that up. That too, and some more.
What was wrong with your value system then?
Mm.
You know,
Right.
now you want to erase, you know, that stuff, and you know what's that little gum eraser you have on the end of your pencil? Anybody remember pencils? Yeah, you know, you want to erase that. You know, you want to modify it. You can't modify that.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
I was going to say, to Ben's point and some more, Mike, so, like the spirit of, so the thing that I have to push back, and people of color have to push back in this church, right? It is the spirit of exceptionalism, right? That not tokenism is what white folk will do to make things feel like, you know, better, right? Exceptionalism is that pride that people of color have of being the only one in the room, or being the first, or being, being supplying the comfortability, if you will, for other populations. And I buck against that, because I've seen what happens, and the devaluing that doesn't allow the future to come, or people that we're raising to come to participate, because you're trying to be the only one. And the second thing that I was going to say is, right, the survival for those of us that have been here has been because of what you described. Is you could walk away from this if you wanted to, because your livelihood is with Ford. And I have to also be honest that, I have strong connections to other religious traditions. I could still be AME, I could be Kojic, and get major. I graduated from Morehouse. They always recruit us to some of the major churches. They asked me to be a candidate for Riverside in New York, Abyssinian, because of those options. But I don't live into that understanding that just because things can be well for me doesn't mean that it's not going to be well for those that are coming after me. And if we don't speak up, and if we don't engage, then things will also not happen, and we will end up, the church will be silent, continue to be silent.
I appreciate that so much, Lamont. I mean, the idea that every room you walk in, you're met with resistance, and the idea that for me to say one thing that's met with resistance gives me great fear is an eye-opening thing to consider. So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have to speak. We just gotta show up and we solve the problem. I just go places and people say, "Hey, here he come again."
Yeah.
That's, I mean, I don't have to work at that.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, we've got about 3 minutes left. I don't know if there's any final questions, comments, thoughts for Lamont. Go ahead.
You know, right now, we're hearing about Navalny, and I've been thinking about Bonhoeffer, Viola Liuzzo, and others who were people of courage and did what they had to do, which is way more than I can imagine doing, you know? But in the book by Walter Wink, Jesus and Nonviolence, the Third Way, one of the questions in the discussion guide says, would you be willing to just do one action?
Mm.
You don't have to be the leader of a peace movement, but just a question of here and there and beginning to participate. And sometimes that gives me hope. I don't have to be, poisoned or shot or something. I have to start small.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You brought up Bonhoeffer, and that's the other thing too. I think when we talk about what people often ask, like, what do you do, right? So when Bonhoeffer was studying in New York, right, we know that he studied and went to Adam Clayton Powell's church, Abyssinian Baptist in Harlem, right, where he worshiped and he learned from the Church of Resistance. The ELCA often talks about is deepening its relationship with historically Black denominations. And it's not just about creating diversity and opening up pathways for full communion for historically Black denominations, but it's deeper than that, right? Why don't we learn from these churches, these historically Black denominations that were birthed out of resistance to the things that we're still trying to resist?
Mm. Mm.
Right? So it's not just about signing papers so that we have enough Black, so that Michael won't be the only Black pastor in Detroit and that we can have bench strength. It's about, why can't the church learn the history of how those churches exist and why they're still needed?
Mm.
And that education, to me, will give us another kind of footing to understand how we understand the relationship or the intersectionality between faith and justice.
Wow.
Good job, Lamont.
Yes.
Good stuff.
Thank you, Lamont.
Yeah.
Lamont, you've set a high bar. This is our first nice meeting, so I'm gonna have to let the next Zoomers know they've got a lot of expectation on their shoulders now.
Y'all got some good people. I saw it, and,
Yeah.
and I wish I could zoom in for some of them if I'm in town in the area. I got to get off of here. I'm at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, so I'm about to do a keynote in 30 minutes. So.
All right, you go. Thanks, Lamont.
All right,
Peace,
take care.
brother.
Bye-bye.
All right, I'm gonna end this Zoom now. Hopefully